So the noise should be a little bit better on the second part here with the earphones. So getting into the furthering the discourse and really getting into targeting the targeted individuals, as they're called, because the name, targeted and an individual, it's kind of like you really are taking a bold leap at identifying what an individual is. Can you be an individual in society? Is the irony that you are an aspect or part of society, living in society or off society, determinant of your individual status? What we find is, in the irony of the term, to call oneself an individual is an implication of a disparate mechanism of separating one from society. So then you start to look at it and you go, well, all targeted individuals, they're not necessarily good people. All targeted individuals aren't necessarily innocent people. And you can come from different perspectives here. Where you could see, like Ian Stevenson looking at reincarnation and actually posturing himself in such a way where he's interviewed folks in different areas of the world, but India mainly. And then, of course, there's those people who take advantage of such claims. But that is to say that you have a reincarnated person, child, who remembers all the details of their town, takes adults, parents, back to that place where they were supposedly from. And it leads back into sort of memory having agency, hazy on that, or biosemiotic fields, or language models and the interpretation, or similarities with genetic similarities or electrical similarities, or somehow, some way, whether it's the zodiac or some sort of imprintable information. A lot of people would argue against the point and say, well, maybe we just don't understand memory, information, and even sort of a spiritual lineage to kind of break off a little bit, a little non-secular. As to say, a certain pattern or form of thinker would invite a certain registry of information that's already written into the field, and that there are certain byproducts that would occur there where more memory or seemingly non-pertinent information to a particular field, like a vendor, somebody who sells, maybe that kid is destined to be a scientist, right? And somebody has a scientific mind and has secretly campaigned, unbeknownst to their family member, using a scientific method, right? But very close to how Nietzsche prescribes or describes people as a psychologist or a medical doctor, right? Where people's approach is the most important fundamental aspect to look at of how they see the world, right? But back to the targeted individual, perhaps through this great work and this huge asymmetrical polarity and operationally going on, where certain people of certain physical characteristics or belief systems that through the brutality of nature, if we're just following sort of the Darwinian evolutionary scale of survival, that the people who are placed into, temporarily placed into a supremacy position are not those who would naturally be who would go through the procurement of such novelties, right? To their belief system, to their religiosity, under the name of certain sexes, cultures, creeds, right? So targeted individuals aren't necessarily good people. They may have even been people in the past, if you want to jump to that, through reincarnation, that weren't such good people. They may be the manifestation of a certain pattern or form through the zodiac, through some sort of scientific method that we don't really understand broadly or largely today, where almost like a minority report mixed in with some other quasi-esoteric technologies where you can see that this person, with all clarity, like as if you're looking through the Hubble and you're looking for amino acid signatures in deep space, right, with a Lucifer telescope, right? But that is to say that clearly you could see and identify a particular individual and see that they are giving off specific direct biomarkers, and that it's matching up with this interface of their brain activity and their nervous system to where this person would invariably commit a crime or go through certain actions where they would liberate themselves and justify certain behaviors, right? And that's reaching, I realize, but it's like there, it's staring at us in the face with MK Ultra, Project Paperclip. It's staring us in the face with the Voice to Skull. It's staring us in the face even with the more minor postulations with Michael Persinger, God Helmet, right? Where you begin to look at this and you go, well, the field itself has information. The field itself has a memory and an agency. Now, whether or not we act more as an emotional interpretation. We have something just like every animal does that is very specific to its biochemistry and emotionality. As it's an emotional filter, and it gets even more specific there, right? So, if you were to look at this like a musical instrument or multiple musical instruments, and you were to say through the phonics that certain characters would be suppressed from brashly speaking out or aggressively, manipulatively earning their status, right? And that there would be an unwritten registry of law that only certain cults or certain distinct groups would be privy to. And then when you go into that and you look at it by the fruits you shall know them, you see the people who hold all the power, who are financing everything. A very strange, arcane and archaic religion begins to manifest time and time again as the true human religion, right? So what we're looking at on a broader scale with the macronomics of this whole thing would be that the targeted individual is needed, required for the totality to stay alive, but that certain mechanisms are in play to suppress and sometimes mute, but downplay the character reference or the resonance, right, or the emanation and resultant effects into the physical. And you also have to look at the fact that now you're looking at people through the eyes of the physical, where entire sects of people that still live on this planet today know that the energy to themselves, they know that the energy through what can only be supposed as spiritualism is really what's happening, that the physical state or status of supremacy or money or having things means absolutely nothing. So you begin to come back to people like Peter Thiel and you go, wow, this is somebody who thinks they're following all these sort of covert specialty or novelty rituals that place them in some sort of place of supremacy, yet it's only in the physical manifestation of this. In other words, there are those who firmly believe that the wealth is found in the cultivation and development of the individual, and even more so in areas that aren't even applicable here, but sort of transcend the temporal aspects of physical manifestation. So that the targeted individual is both a victim here and being played, in a sense, as being born into a system that's rigged. Now, the big question is, when we talk about Stockholm syndrome or trauma bonding or gaslighting and everything else that falls under the guise of that, is it justifiable, right? And the only thing that would make it justifiable is if, in the end, right, if there really is an end, the entire operation would equal out again, and have you made any changes? Now, supposedly, this is one long-ass historicity going on here. When you have 12, 13,000 year half cycles, right? Younger Dryas, great cycles. Yeah, how fucking long has this been going on? And if it's fucked up right now, how long have you been going on with this excuse that you are serving this sort of great work and ultimately things will transition and we haven't made it into the age of Pisces for probably 200 or 300 years from now, or the transit Aquarius Pisces, right? And you know, Tartaria, or the ideas of Tartaria Shalago, you know, the Phalor, the fairies and so forth, giant trees, all the things that have been covered up, that you're acting like you're suppressing information only temporarily, just for the great work, so that everything can be equal out. And it's like, things aren't equal. In fact, there's a very unnatural system. And I believe that it seems odd to break off with this, but not only the stories of, you know, Hercules, obviously Horus, and Solomon, and leading into Gilgamesh, that a lot of these stories and this folklore that leads directly into Marduk and so forth, and into certain Babylonian lore, that really, when you look at the underlying principles that are being talked about there, is that there's a very unnatural sway toward the Morai, or the three witches, or, you know, Clotho, or Mother Circe, you know, and other folklore, other stories, Tiamat, right? Hathor. You get into the witch manipulating. I talked about the octopus on a prior video, changing its shape, changing its form deceptively, but that went on for a long period of time. But I think that this even affects the governing laws of the sea, right? I think this even affects the development of the great white shark growing even more massive and consuming everything in its wake, and other creatures having to respond like a Loch Ness monster type creature in equal proportionality, right? And that the field itself, the ontology itself, is shaped by the on into giants, on into Phalor or fairies, you know, smaller creatures, or spiritual type creatures, or massive manifestations. That this aspect of cultivation, under the guise of cultivation, is the suppression is being done on a cymatic, broad scale of thermodynamic proportions that lead into technologies and rituals of suppression that directly lead to targeted individuals and why they're truly being targeted. And I think that it's not as abstract as it seems. I think the fact that Matthew Brown comes out with something, you know, it's Immaculate Constellation, and then all the inferences, the things that he said after that, and all the other people that are involved in the disclosure, and the huge propensity toward religiosity, talking openly about, you know, government officials talking openly about angels, talking openly about biblical terms, and just using that as sort of an amalgamation methodology to say, well, we don't know what else to call it, and this is the closest to a universal term where everybody can sort of understand this, so we're going to use these terms, when you know that that is another way of misleading, right? So, long story short is that this whole targeted individual aspect is a part of a rerouting system where those who are being targeted, who know who they are being subjected to a much lower experience and gradient to life and existence through the application and the methodology and the means of trying to permanently replace and modify the power structures through an ontological mechanism of the way things naturally would turn out. It's almost like looking at the universal laws and saying, oh, that's terrible, that's brutal. No, we're going to use this to equal things out. And then when you start to look at it, instead of pulling away and going, well, natural law didn't allow me to grow cojones. Natural law didn't naturally start to give me those powers, and I don't understand how it works, but we're going to leave the mechanism in play to suppress these more powerful agents, dog eats dog sort of mentality, right? Because the Komodo dragon shouldn't be allowed to just go consume a baby deer before its, you know, umbilicus is even separated from the mother, right? You see the depictions of this, right? And you're going to fear this. And then I think purposefully Trump was instituted, used, and I'm not making excuses for Trump. I think he's very susceptible, very small in every aspect, especially intellectually. So he's a very easy puppet to maneuver. And I think the fact that Marina Abramovich talked about him, it's pretty scary that she has her eyes on him at all, because we're talking about warlocks and puppet masters here. It's pretty crazy shit.